October 15, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 5 months, yet in a small facility outside Montreal, Quebec, a transport truck carrying an unusual cargo rolled through the gates of a makeshift detention camp. Canadian soldiers stood at attention, their expressions revealing confusion and uncertainty. They had been expecting prisoners of war, but not like this. The 37 women who stepped down from the truck wore the tattered remains of Germanwomen's Auxiliary Corps uniforms, their faces pale and drawn from weeks of transit across the Atlantic. These weren't the hardened soldiers the guards had prepared for. They were young women, some barely out of their teenage years, captured during the final chaotic weeks of fighting in the Netherlands and northern Germany. They had served the Wehrmacht as communication specialists, medical orderlies, and administrative personnel. Now they found themselves thousands of miles from home, standing in the crisp autumn air of a country they knew almost nothing about. Among them was 24-year-old Ilse Brenner, a radio operator from Dresden, who clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world. Her city had been reduced to ash and rubble months before her capture, and she had no idea if any of her family had survived. Beside her stood Anneliese Weber, 19 years old, from a small village near the Austrian border. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing the propaganda that promised she would be helping defend her homeland from invasion. Instead, she had spent the last 2 years of the war witnessing retreat after retreat, watching the certainty of German victory crumble into desperate survival. Lieutenant Marguerite Lavoie, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the facility, watched the new arrivals with a mixture of professional duty and genuine sympathy. She had grown up in Quebec City, speaking French at home and English at school, understanding what it meant to navigate between two worlds. But these German women existed in a far more complicated space. They were enemies. Yet they were also displaced persons caught in circumstances that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The women were led to a converted barracks building that had been hastily prepared for their arrival. The facility had originally housed Italian prisoners earlier in the war, men who had since been repatriated or transferred. Now it would serve as temporary home to these unexpected female captives, while officials in Ottawa decided what to do with them. As the heavy door closed behind them, Ilse felt the weight of her new reality settle over her like a physical burden. Through the small windows, she could see Canadian guards posted outside, their rifles held ready but their expressions uncertain. This wasn't a typical prisoner of war situation, and everyone seemed to know it. That first night, the women spoke only in whispers, their German conversations creating a soft murmur in the darkness. They had been enemies of the Allies, but now they were simply frightened young women facing an unknown future in a strange land. The morning arrived with harsh November cold seeping through the barracks walls. Ilse woke to find frost patterns decorating the inside of the windows, delicate ice crystals that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Around her, the other women stirred slowly, reluctant to leave the thin blankets that provided their only warmth. The reality of their situation felt even heavier in daylight than it had the previous evening. Sergeant Claudette Bélanger entered the barracks promptly at 7 o'clock, her breath visible in the cold air. She carried a clipboard and wore an expression that attempted to balance authority with something that might have been compassion. In careful, slow English, she explained the daily routine. Breakfast at 7:30, work assignments at 9, lunch at noon, more work until 4, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. The women stared at her blankly, understanding perhaps one word in 3. Ilse, who had studied some English in school before the war, caught enough to grasp the basic structure. She translated quietly into German for those nearest to her, her voice barely above a whisper. The others listened intently, their faces betraying no emotion. They had been trained to maintain composure, to represent their country with dignity even in defeat. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, fear and uncertainty churned like a winter storm. Breakfast was served in a separate dining hall, a long room with wooden tables and benches worn smooth by years of use. The Canadian guards watched as the German women filed in silently, maintaining a precise formation that spoke of military discipline. They sat together at one end of the hall, as far from the guards as the space allowed. The meal itself was simple but substantial. Oatmeal porridge, dark bread, margarine, and bitter coffee that steamed in chipped enamel cups. For women who had spent the final months of the war surviving on increasingly meager rations, even this basic fare represented abundance. Yet they ate mechanically, without pleasure or conversation. Annalisa sat across from Ilse, her young face drawn and pale. She had barely spoken since their arrival, and Ilse noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her spoon. The girl was fighting tears, struggling to maintain the composure expected of a German auxiliary member. Ilse wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know what words could possibly help in their situation. After breakfast, the women were assigned to various work details. Some were sent to the laundry facility, others to kitchen duties, and a few to general maintenance tasks around the compound. Lieutenant Lavoie made the assignments based on the limited information available about each woman's skills and background. Ilse found herself assigned to administrative work, her experience as a radio operator apparently qualifying her for record-keeping duties. The work was mind-numbing and simple, but it provided structure to the long, uncertain hours. As she sorted through files in a small office adjacent to the main administrative building, Ilse could hear French conversations in the hallway outside. The first weeks passed in a strange rhythm of routine and tension. The German women moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, their faces carefully blank, their conversations limited to necessary exchanges in hushed German. They had created an invisible wall around themselves, a collective defense against the unknown intentions of their captors. Lieutenant Lavoie observed this self-imposed isolation with growing concern. She had been briefed on the psychological challenges of managing prisoners of war, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the particular complications of female captives. These women weren't simply defeated soldiers. They were displaced persons caught between worlds, neither fully prisoners nor fully protected by the conventions that governed male combatants. Corporal Etienne Rousseau, a quiet man from a farming community near Trois-Rivières, found himself troubled by the situation. He had spent 3 years fighting in Europe, had seen German soldiers as enemies to be defeated, but watching these thin, frightened women moving silently through the compound challenged everything he had trained himself to feel about the enemy. One morning in late November, he noticed Dorothea Klein struggling with a heavy bucket of coal, her slight frame clearly unequal to the task. Without thinking, he stepped forward to help. Dorothea flinched visibly at his approach, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Rousseau stopped, raised his hands to show he meant no harm, then slowly reached for the bucket handle. For a long moment, they stood frozen in an awkward tableau. Then Dorothea released her grip, stepped back, and watched as he carried the coal to its destination. She offered no thanks, no acknowledgement beyond a brief nod. But something had shifted, however slightly. Private Harold Mitchell, barely 20 years old, had been assigned to guard duty outside the barracks. He spent long hours walking the perimeter, watching the women through the windows as they went about their limited activities. He noticed how they mended their worn uniforms with careful precision, how they maintained strict cleanliness despite limited resources, how they seemed to draw strength from their collective discipline. One evening, he heard singing coming from inside the barracks. The melody was unfamiliar, the words in German, but the sound was hauntingly beautiful. The women's voices blended in harmony, creating something that transcended language and nationality. Mitchell found himself standing still, listening, forgetting for a moment that these were supposed to be enemies. Inside the barracks, the singing had started spontaneously. Irmgard Schultz, who had sung in a church choir before the war, had begun a traditional folk song from her childhood. One by one, the other women had joined in, their voices finding comfort in the shared cultural memory. For those few minutes, they weren't prisoners in a foreign land. They were simply German women, connected by the music of home. Ilse sat on her bunk, listening but not singing. She was thinking about the guard who had helped Dorothea with the coal, about the small gesture that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. December arrived with heavy snow that blanketed the compound in white silence. The Canadian Guards had begun preparing for the holidays, and there was talk of allowing some kind of celebration for the prisoners. Lieutenant Lavoie had written to her superiors requesting permission to organize a modest observance, arguing that maintaining morale among the German women was essential to preventing despair and potential incidents. The response came back with cautious approval, provided the celebration remained simple and supervised. On the morning of December 10th, a visitor arrived at the camp gates. Madame Thérèse Gagnon was a baker from Montreal whose nephew had been killed fighting in France. She had come at the request of a local church group that had been coordinating relief efforts for displaced persons throughout the region. Lieutenant Lavoie met her in the administrative office, uncertain what to expect from this stout, silver-haired woman who carried a large wicker basket covered with a checked cloth. Madame Gagnon spoke in rapid French, her hands gesturing expressively as she explained her mission. She had brought traditional Quebec sugar pie, tarte au sucre, made from a recipe passed down through 4 generations of her family. It was a gesture of Christian charity, she insisted, though her eyes suggested something more complex. Perhaps she was trying to make sense of her nephew's death by extending kindness to young women who might have been his enemies. Lieutenant Lavoie hesitated, then agreed to allow the gift. That afternoon, the German women were assembled in the dining hall for what was announced as a special occasion. They entered warily, expecting another administrative announcement or perhaps new work assignments. Instead, they found the table set with plates and forks, and in the center of each table sat generous slices of golden brown pie, the surface glistening with maple syrup and cream. Madame Gagnon stood near the entrance, watching as the women took their seats. Corporal Rousseau and Private Mitchell stood guard, but their posture had relaxed slightly. Sergeant Bélanger explained in her careful English that this was a traditional Canadian dessert, a gift from the local community. Ilse translated quietly, her voice uncertain. The women stared at the pie with confusion and suspicion. In their experience, nothing came without strings attached, without hidden costs or ulterior motives. Why would their captors offer them such obvious luxury? What did they want in return? Annalise reached out tentatively, her fork hovering over the slice before her. The smell was intoxicating, rich with brown sugar and butter and pure maple syrup, scents that awakened memories of peacetime, of normalcy, of a world before war had consumed everything. She took a small bite, and her eyes widened. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, so intense after months of bland prison rations that it was almost painful. The pie was rich and smooth, the crust flaky and buttery, the filling an impossible combination of sugar and cream that seemed to represent everything their lives had been missing. Around the room, other women were experiencing the same revelation. Forks moved slowly to mouths, expressions of suspicion giving way to something else entirely. Hildegard Meyer closed her eyes as she tasted the pie, and tears began streaming down her weathered face. The sound began quietly, a single sob from Hildegard that she tried desperately to suppress. But the sweetness of the pie had broken through defenses built over months of hardship and years of war. The simple act of tasting something so purely good, so untainted by suffering or deprivation, had cracked something fundamental inside her. Within moments, the crying spread through the dining hall like a wave. Annalise wept openly, her young face crumpling as she took another bite of pie through her tears. Ursula Franca, who had maintained stoic composure since their capture, found herself shaking with silent sobs. Dorothea Klein covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. Even Irmgard Schultz, always so controlled and dignified, felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the taste of the sugar pie awakened memories she had tried desperately to bury. The Canadian Guard stood frozen, completely unprepared for this response. Private Mitchell looked to Corporal Rousseau with panic in his eyes, uncertain whether they should intervene or retreat. Lieutenant Lavoie moved forward instinctively, then stopped, recognizing that what was happening was not a crisis but a release. Madame Gagnon watched from her position near the door, her own eyes glistening. She had lost her nephew to this war, had carried her grief like a stone in her chest for 2 years. Yet watching these young German women break down over a simple pie, she felt something shift inside herself. These were not monsters. They were daughters and sisters, girls who had been caught up in something far larger than themselves. Ilse sat at her table, fork suspended halfway to her mouth, watching the emotional collapse happening around her. She had taken one bite of the pie and felt the same overwhelming surge of feeling that had broken the others. The sweetness was almost unbearable after so long without such simple pleasures, but it was more than just the taste. It was what the pie represented. Someone had baked this with care, had taken time and precious ingredients to create something beautiful for them, for enemy prisoners, for German women who should have been hated. The contradiction was too much to process. She thought of her mother's kitchen in Dresden, of Sunday afternoons when the smell of baking filled their apartment. She thought of her younger sister, who had loved sweets with such innocent enthusiasm. Were they alive? Were they somewhere in the ruins of their city, struggling to survive? Or had they been consumed by the firestorm that had destroyed Dresden? The questions she had been holding at bay rushed over her, and she began to cry as well. Sergeant Bélanger moved quietly through the room, placing her hands gently on shoulders, offering clean handkerchiefs, speaking soft words in French that none of the German women could understand, but whose meaning was clear in her tone. There was no judgment in her actions, no contempt for this display of weakness, just simple human compassion. The crying continued for nearly 20 minutes, a collective purging of months of suppressed emotion. When it finally began to subside, the women sat in exhausted silence, embarrassed by their loss of control, but also strangely lighter. The days following the sugar pie incident brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the camp. The invisible wall the German women had constructed around themselves had developed cracks, and through those openings, tentative connections began to form. Sergeant Claudette Bélanger had observed the emotional breakthrough in the dining hall and recognized an opportunity. She approached Lieutenant Lavoie with a proposal to organize informal language lessons, arguing that better communication would improve both security and morale. Lavoie, who had been contemplating similar measures, granted immediate approval. The first lesson took place on a cold December afternoon in the recreation room, a small space with mismatched furniture and a wood stove that provided marginal warmth. Bélanger had set up a makeshift chalkboard and prepared basic vocabulary lists in both English and French. She had invited any of the German women who wished to participate, expecting perhaps a handful to attend. Instead, 23 of the 37 prisoners appeared, including Ilse and Anneliese. The lesson began awkwardly, with Bélanger writing simple words on the board, and the German women attempting to pronounce them. Bread became pain in French and bread in English, though the German women struggled with the English pronunciation. Water was eau and water, tree was arbre and tree. The women repeated the words carefully, their voices tentative at first but gaining confidence as the hour progressed. Ilse discovered that her pre-war English studies had given her an advantage, and she found herself helping translate Bélanger's instructions for the others. It felt strange to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond simply existing from one day to the next. Annalisa struggled more with the unfamiliar sounds, but her youth gave her an enthusiasm that the older women lacked. She practiced each word multiple times, her face lighting up when Bélanger nodded approval at her pronunciation. Corporal Rousseau had been standing guard during the lesson, but found himself drawn into the activity. When Bélanger asked if any of the guards wanted to learn some German words in exchange, he surprised himself by volunteering. The women taught him basic phrases, laughing gently when his accent mangled the words beyond recognition. It was the first time any of the guards had heard the German women laugh, and the sound transformed the atmosphere completely. Private Mitchell, emboldened by Rousseau's example, asked how to say "good morning" in German. Dorothea Klein taught him "Guten Morgen," repeating it slowly until he could approximate the pronunciation. The next morning, when he passed her on his rounds, he offered the greeting. Dorothea stopped in surprise, then responded with a small smile and a return greeting. It was a tiny moment, barely significant, yet it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship from captor and captive to something approaching human equals. The language lessons became a regular occurrence, held 3 times each week. But the real education was happening in the spaces between words, in the shared laughter over mispronunciations, in the patient corrections and small victories of understanding. The women were learning more than vocabulary. They were learning that their enemies could be teachers, that kindness could exist without ulterior motive, that perhaps the world was more complex than the propaganda had told them. January 1946 brought the first mail delivery from Europe. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication channels between displaced persons and their families, and a packet of letters arrived at the Montreal facility on a gray afternoon when fresh snow was falling steadily outside. Lieutenant Lavoie held the thin bundle of envelopes with a sense of dread. She knew that some of these letters would contain devastating news, that the connections they might restore could bring as much pain as comfort. She called the women whose names appeared on the envelopes to her office, one by one, handing over the precious correspondence with quiet sympathy. Ilse was among the first called. Her hands trembled as she accepted the single envelope bearing her name, the address written in handwriting she didn't recognize. She returned to the barracks before opening it, needing privacy for whatever revelation it contained. The letter was from a neighbor, Frau Dietrich, who had survived the firebombing of Dresden. Ilse read the words slowly, her vision blurring as the message became clear. Her mother and father had died in the bombing, seeking shelter in a basement that became their tomb when the building collapsed. Her younger sister Karen had survived initially, but had succumbed to typhus 3 months later in a refugee camp. Frau Dietrich had written these facts with brutal directness, perhaps understanding that false comfort would be worse than honest truth. Ilse sat on her bunk, the letter clutched in her hands, feeling as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. She had known, logically, that her family might be dead. Dresden's destruction had been reported even before her capture. But knowing and having confirmation were entirely different experiences. The last fragile thread connecting her to her previous life had been severed. She was truly alone in the world. Anneliese received no letter, which was somehow worse than bad news. The absence of communication meant continued uncertainty, endless questions without answers. Were her parents alive? Her 3 brothers? Her grandmother, who had raised her after her mother's death? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, hope and despair existing simultaneously in an exhausting balance. Other women had similar experiences. Hildegard learned that her husband had died in Soviet captivity. Irmgard discovered that her family home had been seized by occupying forces and her elderly parents had disappeared without trace. Ursula received confirmation that her entire extended family in East Prussia had been killed or displaced during the Soviet advance. The letters that arrived painted a picture of a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered or destroyed. The country had been divided among occupying powers. Those who had survived were struggling with starvation, disease, and the complete collapse of civil society. But the letters also contained something else, something that disturbed the women even more than news of personal losses. Several included oblique references to revelations about concentration camps, about systematic atrocities that were now being documented and prosecuted. One letter mentioned trials happening in Nuremberg, where former leaders were being held accountable for crimes the letter writer could barely bring herself to describe. That evening, Ilse asked Lieutenant Lavoie if she could access newspapers from the past year, wanting to understand what had been happening in Germany during and after the final collapse. Lavoie hesitated, knowing what those newspapers would reveal, then agreed. The newspapers Lieutenant Lavoie provided were American and Canadian publications from the previous year, their pages filled with photographs and accounts that seemed impossible to believe. Ilse sat in the camp library, a small room with donated books and outdated magazines, and forced herself to read every word, to study every grainy photograph. Images of liberation at Bergen-Belsen showed skeletal figures barely recognizable as human beings. Accounts from Dachau described systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Testimony from survivors detailed horrors that Ilse's mind struggled to accept as real. She had served the Wehrmacht. She had believed she was defending her homeland from invasion, protecting German culture and civilization. Now she was confronting evidence that the regime she had served had committed atrocities beyond anything she had imagined possible. Other women joined her in the library over the following days, each seeking to understand what their country had done. They read in silence, their faces reflecting shock, denial, and finally, a crushing guilt. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues. They were young women who had joined auxiliary services believing the propaganda about defensive war and national pride. Now they were learning that their service, however peripheral, had supported something monstrous. Anneliese found Ilse there one afternoon, tears streaming down her face as she stared at photographs from Auschwitz. The younger woman had been reading accounts of the Nuremberg trials, learning details about systematic extermination programs that had operated while she was filing paperwork and transmitting radio messages. She looked up at Ilse with devastated eyes and whispered in German, "What were we part of? What did we help make possible?" The question haunted all of them, even though they had not personally committed atrocities, even though they claimed not to have known the full extent of what was happening. They had been cogs in the machine that made it all possible. Their service, their obedience, their unquestioning faith in their leaders had contributed to the system that enabled genocide. The weight of this realization was crushing. That evening, the women gathered in small groups throughout the barracks, speaking in hushed German about what they had learned. Some tried to maintain denial, insisting the reports must be exaggerated propaganda. But most recognized the truth in what they had read. The evidence was too extensive, too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources to dismiss. Dorothea spoke what many were thinking. How can we go back? How can we return to a Germany that did these things and claim we had no responsibility? The question hung in the cold air of the barracks. Repatriation had always been presented as inevitable, the natural conclusion to their captivity. Prisoners of war were returned to their homelands once hostilities ceased, but the idea of returning to Germany now felt impossible. They would be returning to a country they no longer recognized, to face judgment from both occupying forces and their own countrymen. Those who had survived the camps would rightfully ask where people like them had been, what they had done while the atrocities unfolded. Meanwhile, their daily life in the Canadian camp had evolved into something unexpected. The language lessons continued. Madame Gagnon had returned several times with more baked goods, each visit softening the boundaries between prisoner and free citizen. The Bergeron family, who owned a farm outside Montreal, had begun visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, bringing fresh eggs and engaging the women in halting conversations that mixed German, French, and English. Spring arrived in March 1946 with the first signs of thaw. Ice on the compound began to melt, revealing patches of brown grass beneath the snow. With the changing season came official notification from Ottawa. Repatriation procedures would begin within 6 weeks. All German prisoners of war would be processed for return to occupied Germany through displaced persons camps in Europe. Lieutenant Lavoie called a General Assembly to announce the timeline and explain the procedures. The 37 women gathered in the dining hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle. Lavoie spoke clearly in English, with Sergeant Bélanger translating key points into French, and Ilse quietly rendering both into German for those who still struggled with the languages. When Lavoie finished and asked if there were questions, Ilse stood slowly. Her English had become fluent over the months, her accent still present, but her words clear and confident. "Lieutenant Lavoie, may I speak for some of us?" she asked. Permission was granted. Ilse looked around at the other women, seeing silent encouragement in their faces. Anneliese stood as well, followed by Dorothea, Irmgard, Hildegard, and 7 others, 12 women in total, standing together in a decision they had debated for weeks. "We wish to request permission to remain in Canada," Ilse said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Lieutenant Lavoie blinked in surprise. Corporal Rousseau and Private Mitchell exchanged confused glances. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war did not request to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. Ilse continued, explaining what they had discussed among themselves during countless late-night conversations. Germany was not their home anymore. The country they had served no longer existed, replaced by something they could not recognize or support. More than that, they had found something in Canada they feared losing. They had experienced kindness where they expected cruelty. They had been given opportunities to work, to learn, to become better people than they had been when they arrived. "Here," Ilse said, "we have been shown what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have learned that people can choose forgiveness over hatred. We do not wish to lose that." The implications were staggering. Legally, they remained enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided for repatriation, not extended residence. But their emotional appeal touched something beyond legal procedures. Lieutenant Lavoie promised to forward their unprecedented request to her superiors in Ottawa. The response took 3 weeks to arrive. During that time, the 12 women continued their routines with renewed purpose, as if their contributions might influence the distant decision-makers. Finally, word came. The women could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would no longer be prisoners, but they would need sponsors, employment, and housing. The uncertainty was daunting, but they had made their choice. Madame Gagnon immediately offered to sponsor Ilse. Dr. Cartier arranged for Anneliese to train as a medical assistant. The Bergeron family stepped forward for Dorothea. One by one, the community that had learned to see them as human beings rather than enemies offered them futures. 25 years later, in the autumn of 1971, Ilse Brenner stood before a gathering at McGill University in Montreal. She had been invited to speak at a symposium on reconciliation and post-war immigration, her story having become a quiet legend in Quebec's German-Canadian community. Now a Canadian citizen with grown children, she carried with her the same small canvas bag she had clutched on that cold October day in 1945. Her hair had silvered, but her eyes remained sharp and thoughtful. She spoke in flawless English with only the faintest trace of her German origins, telling the assembled students and scholars about the moment that had changed everything. It wasn't the moment of capture, she explained, or even the moment of arrival in Canada. It was the moment Madame Thérèse Gagnon had brought sugar pie to enemy prisoners and watched them weep. That pie, Ilse said, represented everything we thought we understood about the world being wrong. We had been taught that our enemies were cruel and heartless. Instead, we found kindness. We expected punishment. We received compassion. That single act of generosity from a woman who had lost her nephew fighting against Germany created a crack in our certainty that eventually shattered everything we believed. Anneliese sat in the audience, now Dr. Anneliese Weber Mitchell, having married Private Harold Mitchell in 1948. She had become a respected nurse at Montreal General Hospital, her gentle manner with patients a direct legacy of the mercy she had experienced as a prisoner. Beside her sat Dorothea Klein-Bergeron, who had married into the family that sponsored her and now ran a successful bakery in partnership with her mother-in-law. Of the 12 women who had chosen to stay in 1946, 9 remained in Quebec, fully integrated into the communities that had taken a chance on former enemies. They had built lives, raised families, and contributed to their adopted homeland in ways that honored the second chance they had been given. The women who had returned to Germany had carried with them stories of Canadian kindness that influenced how they approached the difficult work of rebuilding their shattered country. Several had maintained correspondence with the women who stayed, creating a network of connection that transcended nationality and history. Ilse concluded her speech by reflecting on what their story meant. "We came as prisoners of war," she said, "but we left as something no one expected, as Canadians, not because we were seeking escape from consequences, but because we had discovered something worth defending: the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the understanding that hatred is not destiny." She held up a worn recipe card, Madame Gagnon's original sugar pie recipe, which the baker had given her before passing away in 1963. This recipe represents more than dessert. It represents the choice to see humanity in your enemies, to offer sweetness instead of bitterness, to believe that people can change. The story of the German women who wept over Quebec sugar pie had become a testament to transformation, proving that even in war's aftermath, compassion could overcome hatred, and former enemies could become cherished citizens.